Well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to these 2 days and learning from others in this room. This is joint work with Hunt, Joe, and 2 promising PhD students from Chicago, Kane and Max Maydanchik. Okay, so in this paper, we evaluate the central part of the Inflation Reduction Act. As you might remember, the Inflation Reduction Act was this, by some assessors, the most ambitious climate investment in world history. It had a series of goals to mitigate climate change, to create green jobs, conduct industrial policy, and sort of many others. And whereas they had many sort of credits and subsidies in it, a central piece were these electric vehicle tax credits that we are studying here, which had over a decade a projected range of costs from 70 to almost $400 billion, depending on sort of the uptake of the program. Now, after the new administration was elected, initially the Speaker of the House said we should use a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, to modify these EV tax credits. However, then President Trump said, I hate green tax credits, and so we just lost them. The research questions we're going to study here are what are the IRA EV credits efficiency and distributional effects? Would there be gains from differentiating these subsidy policies across vehicles? And broadly, we see it as a showcase of quote-unquote green industrial policy that sort of pits trade against the environment and thinks both about foreign and domestic welfare. And what I find personally quite interesting is that even though this was a climate bill, by some interpretation, the leaders from other countries were quite negative about it, right? Sort of, so Emmanuel Macron called it like super aggressive and not meeting like the common objective. So that's interesting because you have sort of, on the one hand, the positive externalities the US is creating on the rest of the world by doing something against climate change. On the other hand, through the industrial policy angle, they're actually shifting profits towards US companies away from foreign firms and sort of reducing foreign welfare. Okay, let me summarize some of our key results. Well, because this had sort of an environmental motivation, we first actually examine the externalities that are created from driving either electric or gasoline vehicles. So we find that the global social cost of carbon, EVs, as you might have expected, have lower, on average, lower sort of externalities than gasoline vehicles. However, there is a similar externality dispersion within electric vehicles as within gasoline vehicles. Sort of, so the blanket view that EVs are like good for society and the environment, and like GVs are bad is a bit simplistic. When we conduct an event study analysis using sort of various changes in credit eligibility, we find that the short-run incidence of these credits largely fell on the consumers, to a large fraction, sort of they were passed on to consumers. And we'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but there were trade restrictions or Buy American restrictions on the purchases of electric vehicles, but not on leased vehicles. So companies could basically Hyundai Financial Services could purchase from Hyundai Manufacturing, then register the car and claim the credit, and then sort of lease the vehicle to consumers. And in this way, sort of these Buy American restrictions could be avoided if you sort of are leasing the vehicle instead of purchases it, and that sort of drives a massive shift towards leasing. Now, then, utilizing an equilibrium supply and demand model, sort of estimated to sort of rich microdata and some of the estimates from our event studies, we find that overall there were sizable benefits to the US from these credits. So on a marginal value of public funds basis, there's like a $1.96 return compared to the pre-IRA policy for each dollar of credits given. So that's like a sizable return. When you compare it to a world without EV credits, the benefits actually shrink to $1.11. So now it depends on what you think is the marginal cost of raising public funds. If you think that's sort of one, as sort of, I don't know, in many models it is sort of economists use that is assumed, then it's still like a sort of a positive welfare. If you think the marginal cost of raising public funds is actually, I mean, 1.4 or so, which some public finance economists have argued, then this is less clear that this is a great use of public funds. Now, getting additional EVs on the road is expensive because a lot of these credits go to consumers who are inframarginal. So in other words, they would have bought the EVs even without the subsidy. So actually getting, again, depending on what is your comparison, the pre-policy or no credits, takes around $30,000 to get like an additional EV on the road. We find this leasing loophole does poorly from a US welfare perspective. So I don't know, it would have sort of been better not to have this, this loophole. And if we were going to differentiate subsidies across models, we could have doubled the benefits. Finally, our estimates are that removing the IRA EV credits leads to like above 20% drop in registrations for electric vehicles. Okay, briefly, what is new here? So this is the first exposed microeconomic welfare analysis of a central part of the IRA. It's also, to my knowledge, the first sort of joint analysis of profit shifting and the environment. Finally, we add sort of to the literature on auto-market environmental regulation by sort of jointly thinking about EV externalities, including fiscal externalities, fatal accidents, market power, and the profit-shifting motive. Okay, let me give you a little bit of background. So we have actually had tax credits in the US for electric vehicles for a long time. First established still under the Bush administration. So there were the $7,500 credits per new EVs. However, the policy from 2008 had eligibility caps. So each manufacturer, the vehicle from each manufacturer would only qualify up to that manufacturer having had 200,000 vehicles registered that then led to consumers receive the credits. So by 2018, 2019, both Tesla and GM were ineligible to sort of receive credits. Toyota and Ford later became ineligible, and Stellantis and BMW would have become ineligible in 2023. So the pre-policy on which the IRA sort of was built, largely at the end actually only offered credits to foreign car makers because most of the US car makers had already received the cap, sort of. So that's why some of the welfare gains actually are quite large when you compare to the pre-IRA policy, because towards the end of that policy, the pre-IRA policy was not particularly sensible. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act made several amendments to this credits. It actually kept the level the same, but then it put restrictions on what kind of buyers are eligible. So there were household income limits. And importantly, trade restrictions. So the vehicle had to be assembled in North America, which for electric vehicles largely means assembled in the US, because the share of EVs made in Canada and Mexico is quite small. And then later also a large enough fraction of components of the vehicle have to come from the US or allied countries. It also had a separate commercial credit that businesses sort of could claim for registering electric vehicles. And those didn't have any of these Buy American restrictions. That was clarified in late 2022 that sort of, I don't know, this leasing loophole actually kind of would be legal. So that you could like take a foreign-made vehicle, the financial services registered it, and can claim the credit when then leasing it to consumers. So here's a quick timeline. So August 2022, the IRA was signed. Right away, vehicles not assembled in North America were excluded. Next event time is January 2023. Now the leasing loophole has opened up, and also vehicles became eligible for credits that were made by manufacturers that had previously reached the cap. So Tesla and GM, for example, became eligible again for EV credits. And then April 2023 onwards, we exclude or reduce credits by half for vehicles that have too much foreign battery components or use too many foreign minerals. And our data sort of ends in 2023, and there have been moderate subsequent changes until the elimination, but we won't cover them here. Okay, so what is an observation here? Observation is a combination of a vehicle make, let's say BMW, a vehicle model, let's say X5, vehicle trim, then a particular version of that X5, and then a powertrain. So like either EV or GV or hybrid. And we have monthly data. Registration counts come from Experian. This is national US car registration data by model, by months. One object we're going to define as a lease share, which is the ratio of the leases over the registrations. Price data comes from various sources. We use data from Cox Automotive. They run dealership software on around 1/3 of the US car dealerships. So here we have transaction level microdata. Now this excludes Tesla, Rivian, and Lucid, where we get the prices from those websites. We also have the registration data for the entire state of California, which also has registration prices, which are highly correlated with those from Cox. And then another important data source is the second choice survey data from Strategic Vision. That includes information about the car buyers, such as household income, which vehicle you bought or leased, and then what your second choice would have been. So if you didn't buy or lease that vehicles, what sort of choice would you have made? Alternatively, that's going to be helpful to think about the substitution patterns, as you change the credits. Okay. So let me give a brief summary of the work we do on assembling data on the externalities. This is largely bean counting, but so some assumptions here is that each vehicle is driven for 150,000 miles over its lifetime. We take a global social cost of carbon of $241. That's I don't know what others had found, and then updated by inflation to 2023 numbers. Now, importantly, the US social cost of carbon is actually substantially lower than that. So when you think about industrial policy, right, then in principle you might only want to evaluate the welfare changes to the US, and that's given that the global social cost of carbon counts the effects of carbon also in other countries. Some policymakers might want to use the US social cost of carbon in their objective function. We don't take a principled stance on that, but we're going to compute results both with either the global or the US social cost of carbon. Now, the externalities that we take here into account are the pollution created by manufacturing the vehicles and recycling them. the driving sort of pollution from CO2 as well as local air pollution. Here we heavily build on work by Holland and co-authors. We also take into account the externality that are created by fatal accidents, which have been shown in this past work by Anderson and Aufhammer to be strongly correlated with vehicle weight. And that sort of matters here because electric vehicles on average are heavier than gasoline vehicles. So we sort of take that into account. And then we take into account positive fiscal externalities either like from collecting gasoline taxes or from electricity markups that sort of help building new power plants. Okay, briefly some description. Yeah. Yes.
About the assumption of the fact that each car is driven throughout. Is that kind of a standard, I guess? The way I was wondering, or I was thinking about, I'm wondering about the assumption about the first general parameter on lifetime miles.
Yeah.
Mainly because I was just thinking about the subsidies as a potentially short-term policy to induce a transition to an equilibrium where now everyone's driving an electric car and there's no more subsidies. And so there, I think, wouldn't you want to subsidize people who drive intensively kind of their cars and want everyone who only drives like around town fewer miles to keep their gas cars, and then you don't have to subsidize as many. So is it true that like all of these cars are being driven? I would imagine there's a ton of variation in how much.
Totally. Yeah, we don't have great data on this sort of by vehicle, and it might also change about the future, right? Even if you took the snapshot of how much was the vehicle driven, like it might change. But it is, I know. You raise a good point, and it's something for us to think about. But for now, I don't have a better way sort of doing it. So, raise a good point. Thank you. If you put sort of this externality data together, as I mentioned earlier, you do get the pattern that you might expect that on average externalities are lower for gasoline vehicles than for electric vehicles. Electric vehicles shine sort of especially on the pollution part. They shine less on the excess weight and accidents. That these excess weight and accidents is quantitatively as important as pollution. That's sort of not new. That's also sort of in the Anderson and Aufhammer paper. Now, if you do use the domestic social cost of carbon instead of the global social cost of carbon, actually EVs and GVs look largely similar in terms of total externalities. Now, foreign EVs are somewhat greater have somewhat greater negative externalities. Or here, I'm actually plotting fuel efficiency. So they have lower fuel efficiency, the 30D ineligible vehicles. There is quite a bit of dispersion in these externalities, both for GVs and EVs. We might be subsidizing some EVs that have sort of worse externalities than the GVs that are ineligible. So, for example, the Rivian R1S was eligible for like a partial tax credits, whereas the Toyota Prius hybrid, which doesn't have a plug, wasn't eligible, and the externalities from the hybrid actually are lower. Okay, let me briefly go through the event studies. So we're going to look at three outcomes around the changes in eligibility. The first is what is the change in purchase price. And recall that the credit for purchases is claimed by the consumer on their tax form. So no change in price here is actually good news for the consumer because then you later are going to claim the credit with your taxes. So what we find here is that around changes in vehicle eligibilities, prices were largely flat. Okay, so which here you can sort of interpret as sort of close to full pass-through to consumers. When we look at relative lease prices, so where we sort of sum up the cost that are involved with leasing a vehicle and then subtract the cost of purchasing a vehicle, we find that that is falling substantially, especially sort of for the foreign-made vehicles that were sort of excluded in August 2022. Here, the relative lease price drops around by $5,000. The U.S. car makers that sort of later became eligible, Tesla and GM, they passed on the sort of this leasing benefit somewhat less. So there we only find like around $2,000 decline in the relative lease price. And here in the middle, it's not a data error. It looks a little bit funny, but there was like Tesla slashed their prices before the change in eligibility in the months before. So it's sort of driving, making this middle graph a little bit funny. Yes. Yeah.
Just say again, what is the variation that you're using? So it's Tesla, GM versus the foreign car companies?
So this is against gasolines. So we have done it multiple ways, but the plots I'm showing you here is the change in price for the EVs against the GVs at the same time. We have also done a version where we have used a small set of EVs that had no change in credit eligibility as a control. It's fairly similar, but we saw like the GVs actually kind of further from the EVs, so it's a cleaner control.
But I thought that the vast majority of EVs sold in the US were not eligible because they were for foreign made, or most of the components were for foreign made, right?
Right? That's not quite right. So yeah, many vehicles were indeed eligible. Yeah. But okay, is this still to your control question? It seems like.
I'm just trying to understand the variation.
So the variation is here against GVs, sort of against gasoline vehicles around that time. Thanks for clarifying that. That's important. Okay. Thank you. And then finally, I was sort of showing like an analogous pattern to the change in the relative prices. The relative price of leasing is falling. You see a big response in the lease share. So that rises from like a baseline of like around 15 percentage points by 45 percentage points for these foreign made EVs on the left. And you see a moderate and late uptick in the Tesla GM leasing, consistent with sort of the pattern when they are starting to pass that on. And you also see that some of the other EVs that include vehicles that, for example, had foreign made parts and became, some of them became ineligible in April 2023, they are also sort of starting to shift toward leasing. Okay. Now, we want to sort of do counterfactuals on these policies. So for that, we need a model. So let me sort of briefly describe what we do here. This is a static model, partial equilibrium for the car industry with standard sort of quasi-linear utility assumption. And the baseline, we assume lump sum revenue recycling. So the marginal cost of public funds is equal to 1, but we also sort of relax it in some extensions. Demand is sort of nested logit for a given household type. Nash-Bertrand supply, meaning that car makers sort of are choosing prices strategically. And the choice set is sort of the vehicles available in 2023 or an outside option of sort of not buying a vehicle. So how should we think about this model? So it's not like the non-model of the very short run where you kind of would have inelastic supply. It's also not the very long run because we sort of abstract away from some things that might be important over the long run, like model entry, supply chain adjustment, and et cetera. Some of the things that Mark and Eduardo are going to talk about. But we think it's for the short and medium run, given that this policy only lasted for a little over 2 years. Actually, maybe the short to medium run is something still important. Okay, so we can go over this quickly. I don't want to sort of tire you with notation. The thing sort of perhaps to point out is here the consumer eye and credit eligibility also sort of varies by household eye depending on the household income. The price sensitivity might also vary by household income. Otherwise, it is sort of a fairly standard discrete choice. A demand model within each household type, particular income, the preferences have kind of a nested logit structure that which you can think of. There are some shocks to how much do you like EVs versus GVs or not buying a car. Then within each vehicle category, you can pick between different classes like a sedan or SUV. And then within each class, then you might have sort of, again, heterogeneity and preferences for how much you like a vehicle of the particular class. And then final sort of choice you have to make is on the buy-lease decision on the purchase type. Okay, we sort of skip this. Yeah. Yeah.
The two parameters or the two aggregate parameters that you care about is the market elasticity of demand,
yes,
and the elasticity of supply, right?
Yes.
Because that determines the incidence,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So first, in the demand structure that you just wrote out, what is the parameter that parameterizes the?
It's a price sensitivity. It's a price sensitivity parameter, the alpha, and we have it in the paper. I might not have it on the slide, but like we get like a market elasticity of demand a little over 1, which is sort of in line with what other.
But there, don't you also have an extensive margin as well, right?
Yes. Yeah, there's an so I mean there's sort of a choice. Do you buy a vehicle at all, right? That's sort of what you mean by.
No. What I mean is, do you buy an EV or you buy a gasoline car?
Yes.
Right. So what's the parameter there? I mean, you went through it too quickly.
Yeah. No. Great. So it's going to be. I think it's our sigma G. It's like a correlation, basically how correlated are your draws for getting GVs versus EVs within the EV and GV nest, sort of.
Okay, and then in terms of the supply side, so that you said you were going to skip, but it seems that that's crucial. That is, you want to know then what's the elasticity of supply?
Right. Yeah. So the model is quite simple here. It's like assuming flat supply curves. We're going to back out marginal cost, but
then doesn't that assume the answer then? If you're assuming that supply curves are flat?
I don't think so. But we can talk more about this after. Yeah.
So
right.
Questions. First, do you take the employment multiplier into account? Second, do you recommend getting rid of the Buy America restrictions or getting rid of the leasing loophole? And thirdly, do you take account of the fact that the leased vehicles will eventually hit the secondary market?
Okay, great questions. Employment multiplier, it's work in progress. We're working on this currently. It's not going to be in this slide deck, but it's going to be on the version of the paper. It's going to come out in a month or month and a half. It's sort of, we have now these numbers ready, and you can add that to the policy objective function. Under what people have estimated for value of a job, actually it doesn't change so much what would be the optimal EV credit, whether you take that channel into account. Sorry, I forgot the other two. Maybe we can. Yeah.
Buy America.
Yeah.
Get rid of.
Yes. Yeah. So I'll have. If I get to it, actually, Buy American here is welfare increasing for the U.S. Yeah. Okay. How many? 1 minute. Okay. 1 minute. Okay. So. Okay. Well. Yeah. Okay. 2. Let me stretch the 1 to 2, and I know. I think we have a pretty good sort of. So we're gonna match sort of these facts on like how likely are EVs buyers to, for example, have an EV as a second choice, related to what Changtai sort of asked about. Sort of all of that sort of is in here. The lease response sort of telling us how much likely they are sort of to switch, and then also by household income type that sort of household income types are substantially more likely to buy a vehicle, but also a lot more higher income households are a lot more likely to buy an EV than lower income households. Okay, we do a pretty good job in matching the substitution patterns. Here, leftist data, rightist model implied. Ours is a little bit more checkerboard style, but I think gets sort of some of the key patterns. Okay, so we have some thoughts about optimal policy, but I have to refer you to the paper. Let me do sort of maybe let me address the question that was asked about the Buy American. So this will come here. So the conclusions here is we should actually get rid of or should have gotten rid of the trade. We should have imposed trade restrictions on leases. That would have saved us a lot of government spending. And it would have lowered foreign producer surplus, but actually raised US producer surplus and would have been welfare beneficial. So the leasing loophole has a return of only 45 cents per dollar given. And if we had removed these Buy American restrictions on purchases, it would have been good at global social cost of carbon, but not evaluated at a US social cost of carbon. If you evaluate a US social cost of carbon, the return of that would have been 85 cents per dollar spent. So let me finish here. Thank you.